It's a pleasure to be here and to be able to talk to you about some things that I hope you'll find interesting, but also I hope you find changes the way that we look about dementia. I'll look at dementia a little bit. But before I kick off, there's two things that happened to me over the past couple of days. Two conversations, one that's quite funny and one that's not so funny. So yesterday, I was doing a lecture at a theological college on hearing voices and exploring the whole area of what it means to hear voices, both from a religious perspective and from a perspective of mental health. And after the lecture, somebody came up to me, who shall remain anonymous, and said, "You're a black Scotsman." And I said, "Yes." And said, "Are there many of you?" I said, "I don't know, I haven't actually done a survey. And we don't hang out together very often." So if any of you guys want information on black Scotsmen, I can give you a story relating to one person, but if you want broader data, you'll have to go somewhere else. So that made me laugh. Kind of. But the other story, the thing that happened to me this afternoon, and it didn't make me laugh. So I was having a conversation with a gentleman, and it came up in the conversation that I was going to be talking at this seminar. And I said, "We're going to be talking about faith and dementia." And he said, "But surely these things are total opposites." He said, "In the same way as when you have dementia, you become incompetent to look after your money, incompetent to look after your decision for yourself, you become incompetent in your faith life." And I confess that I've never actually heard somebody say that quite as boldly as that. So we had an interesting conversation, and I told him to come here this afternoon and maybe have his views changed a little bit. He didn't. But there's something interesting there, isn't there? That somehow people think that if you have a little bit of brain damage or even a lot of brain damage, then somehow you cease to be able to relate to God, and God ceases to be able to relate to you. I mean, the thing that we want to do today, more than anything else, is to suggest to you that that's simply not the case. There's certainly some of the ways in which we think about faith, some of the ways in which when we concentrate very much on intellect and reason as being central to our faith lives, then it can seem sometimes that that's what it's all about. But actually it's much deeper, much richer, and much more interesting than that. Otherwise, we'd all be in difficulty. Think about it. You're a disciple, you walk out of here, you trip over the stairs, you crack your head, and you end up with brain damage, and suddenly you become a non-disciple. Now, I would be very surprised if that's the way that God functions. So why would we think that God functions the same way in relation to dementia? So these are the things that I want us to be thinking about this afternoon. So there's a really interesting anthropologist called Clifford Geertz, and he talks about different ways in which we can describe the world, right? So he says, we can describe the world in a thin way, or we can describe the world in a thick way. So a thin description of, I don't know, this afternoon would be, we all were interested in dementia, we got into various forms of transport, we came down here, and we listened to a speaker. All of that's true, but there's not much detail in it. A thick description really digs into the issues. And so a thick description of what we're doing just now is we're people of faith called by Jesus to think about an aspect of being a human being that's profoundly important for society and for the church. And so we come together to learn together in order that we can change our perspective. So a thick description has emotions, has feelings, has perspectives that thin descriptions simply don't have. Now, one of the dangers when we think about dementia is very often people have a very thin description of dementia. So we say it's brain damage, and we kind of stop there. And we say that the person doesn't think the way that they used to be, so therefore they're not the person they used to be. And we kind of stop there. I want us to thicken our understanding of dementia this afternoon, so we can capture a multitude of different ways of looking at it, different stories, different perspectives. And if we see things differently, then ultimately we will respond differently to the things that we see. Because the way in which we describe the world determines what we think we see. And what we think we see will determine how we respond to the things that we see. So it matters the way that we describe things. So let's begin with a story. So there's a really interesting neurologist called Oliver Sacks, who some of you may have come across it. His big book was The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. And what he is, he's a neurologist who really reflects on unusual neurological conditions. And so in this case, he talks about the man who mistook his wife for a hat. One of the stories in there is a man who has a stroke and becomes completely reoriented to the world in a different way. And he constantly uses his wife's hand as a hat rather than his own hat. And he tells this very rich and thick story of what that means for him and what it means for his relationships and his wife's relationships. But there's one story in there that I think will get us into the zone for what we want to be thinking about this afternoon. And it's a story called The Lost Mariner. And it's a story of Jimmy, who lived with Korsakoff's disease. Now, Korsakoff's disease is a form of profound memory impairment that's brought on by excessive use of alcohol. And so the primary symptom is a complete loss of short-term memory. So Sacks would say that he would go into Jimmy's room and they'd have a conversation and he'd look out the window, Jimmy would look out the window, then look back and say, "Oh, Dr. Sacks, I haven't seen you for so long." So he had absolutely no short-term memory. But interestingly, he had some long-term memory. He used to be in the Merchant Navy during the war, and he could remember a good deal of things about his experience in the Merchant Navy up to 1945. After 1945, he couldn't remember anything. And Oliver Sacks was deeply disturbed by Jimmy's situation, so much so that he said that he felt that part of Jimmy's soul was missing. He says this condition has de-souled him. And one day he said this to one of the nurses that worked very closely with Jimmy, and the nurse was clearly shocked. And he said, "Dr. Sacks, why don't you go and look and watch Jimmy at worship?" So Dr. Sacks was a secular Jew. He had no interest in religion whatsoever. But he took the nurse's advice and he went to watch Jimmy in worship. And he was astounded by what he saw. Because in the context of worship, there was no Korsakoffs. There's only Jimmy singing, praying, participating in the sacraments in ways that completely astounded Sacks, because he had written him off as somebody who didn't really have a soul. And so Sacks changed his mind, and he realized that actually we are much more than our memory. Our memory allows us to do certain things, but it doesn't define who we are. And so he had a transformed understanding of what it means to be a human being. What it means to be a human being is not simply to remember things. What it means to be a human being is to participate in things, to be a part of a community, to be a part of a spiritual community in that situation. And that changes perspective. So hold Jimmy's situation in mind as we're kind of moving through where we're going to go to. So the first thing I wanted to think about is dementia is clearly a biomedical condition. Or is it? You know, at one level, it's a neurological condition. You can see it. You can see a good deal of damage that people have within their brains for those people whose brains are scanned. But it's much more than that. I mean, it's very interesting when you look at the studies that have been done for people who are moving from their home into a care home. And very often people with dementia become deeply disturbed, deeply confused, and their condition becomes exacerbated with a change of venue. And that's because dementia relates not simply to your neurology, but to your sociology, to your psychology, to your community. There's much more about dementia than we sometimes think. So, our bodies, first of all, are interactive. So we could say certainly that dementia is brain damage. It's true. But then we have to think about what the brain is and how the brain functions. And one of the interesting things about the brain is that it's interactive, right? So unlike your nails, your teeth, or your hair, which just grow according to preconceived genetic patterns, your brain, and indeed your whole nervous system, but particularly your brain, works in a different way. Every time you engage with something, experience something in the world, your brain records that. And so when I pick this up and I look at this and I concentrate this, the neurons and the synapses in my brain begin to take the shape and the form of this thing. And so I become almost hardwired to understand what this thing is. And so your brain is constantly responding to its environment, which is why childhood trauma can be so devastating, because if you are having trauma in your early stage of your life, when your brain is beginning to develop and begins to take a shape and form, it takes the shape and form of the trauma. And it becomes very difficult later on to shift that, because you're not dealing simply with psychological conditions, you're actually dealing with a change in neurology. And you can see it very clearly in things like post-traumatic stress disorder. One of the reasons why post-traumatic stress disorder is so difficult to shift is because you have a reconfiguration of your neurons and your synapses. It takes the shape of that trauma and constantly plays it back. And you have to then rewire people in order for them to overcome these difficulties. But positively, the brain is constantly responding to its environment in that way. And that doesn't change or stop simply because you have dementia or because you have a degree of brain damage. It's actually something that goes on all the time. And there's a phenomenon that some of you may be familiar with called rementia. And I'll read you just how that works. Clear examples have been noted of rementing, or measurable recovery of powers that had apparently been lost. What that means is that if you put someone in an environment that is stimulating, that is exciting, that is safe and secure, then very often people can reclaim things and aspects of their lives that in a less secure, less safe, less welcoming environment they seem to have lost. So there's something very important about the environment for the way in which dementia manifests itself. Well, you'll find this interesting. So I haven't got my glasses, so I have to look at my phone instead of here, so bear with me. So that's really, this idea of neuroconfiguration is really interesting. It's interesting for this reason. So in a study from 2007 in the Archives of General Psychiatry, you get an exploration of the development of Alzheimer's. And it says, it indicated that people who are lonely are twice as likely to develop Alzheimer's disease. But what's interesting about that study is this. The implication is, that loneliness prevents and sometimes causes neurological damage. Now, if you've heard some of these most disturbing stories where kids, for example, have been locked up in a cupboard for years and they come out and they can't speak. They can't speak because you need to be spoken to in order for that part of your brain to be stimulated and for you to learn speech. If that's never stimulated, then it atrophies. And likewise, for elderly people, loneliness is a very dangerous condition, because if you're not spoken to, if you're not interacting in that sense, then you do have neurological changes that are significant. And so at least part of the neurological issues around dementia relates to your community and your ability of your community to keep you stimulated, keep you in community, keep you loved, keep you cared for, keep you in a safe spiritual environment. So, let me push past that. So just keep these things in mind, that it's something about the community that's significant, and something about the ways in which we act and the things that we do in community is profoundly significant for all of us, but particularly significant for people living with dementia. So I want us to think a little bit about memory. And we're going to now begin to move towards the context of worship with that at the back of our minds. One of the central experiences for many people with certain types of dementia is a profound loss of memory. And culturally, it's a very difficult thing to come to terms with, because we tend to equate memory with who we are. And so, I don't know if you've ever come across people using language like he or she is not the person that she used to be, or I prefer to remember them the way they used to be. That kind of language that goes on around dementia sometimes. Now, that indicates to us a particular way in which we construct our understandings of who we are. And we construct our understandings within a Western culture according to the stories that we tell about ourselves. So as long as we can tell a story about where we've come from, and we can bring that memory, recall, into the present so that we can plan for the future, we are who we are. And so our idea of self as a culture is autobiographical. As long as we can tell our own story and know where we are in the world and be able to plan for the future, then we are who we are. So memory is always assumed to be recall, and recall is central to who we are as a human being. So if we start to lose our memory or lose our recall memory, then people start to use negative language. They start to talk about you as if you're not there or as if you've disappeared. Why? Because you can no longer tell the story that you used to be able to tell. So, there we go. So the way I want us to think about that is that's something that emerges specifically from our culture. It's a Western way of creating our understanding of what a person is. And it's also a Western way of thinking about memory. But there are actually other ways in which we can think about memory. And this is really, really important when we begin to think about memory and worship. So within a Western culture, a Western mindset, we think that memory is passing a piece of time through our mind. That we think about it, we pass time through our mind, and then we make decisions on that basis. But if you take another language such as Spanish, what you find there is that memory is understood as passing a piece of time through your heart. And so rather than thinking that memory is simply something that you do with your mind, actually memory becomes something that you do with your heart, with the whole of who you are, the whole of who you are as a human being. And if you begin to think about memory as being something that you do with your heart, then you have a quite different perspective on what's going on with people with dementia, and you have a much more hopeful perspective in relation to what memory is and whether or not people do lose their memory in the way that we think they do. Because one of the things that we maybe don't take seriously enough is the fact that our bodies remember things. So your body engages with the world over time. We learn habits, we learn practices, and these things are ingrained within our bodies. And part of that learning is our spiritual practices. So when we engage in prayer, in worship, in meditation, in scripture reading, all of these things, so our bodies begin to take the shape and the form of the worship that we engage in. So we might say, some might say that body memory is just muscle memory. It's not meaningful. But I want to suggest that actually it's deeply meaningful, and we'll come back to that in a few moments. So we are what we worship. So our bodies become the things that we worship. A colleague of mine, James Smith, has written a book recently on arguing the case for we are what we love. And he says, yes, that if you're an athlete, and if you spend the whole of your life fascinated by your body, then that's what you worship. But he also points out that within a kind of postmodern culture, that shopping becomes a mode of worship. that people actually substitute some worship activities for shopping. And he points out that the way in which certain shopping malls are laid out is very similar to chapels. You have an atrium, you have surrounding pieces of equipment that help you to see things differently and to attract you in different ways. And so if you shop a lot, then it becomes your place of worship. However, I want us to be thinking about, if you're a Christian, and if you're constantly practicing your faith in your body, then you become what you worship. And the Apostle Paul has something interesting to say here, I think. He says in 2 Corinthians 3, 2-4, he says, the only letter of recommendation we need is you yourselves. Your lives are a letter written in our hearts. Everyone can read it and recognize our good work among you. Clearly, you are a letter from Christ, showing the result of our ministry among you. This letter is written not with pen and ink, but with the Spirit of the living God. It's carved not on tablets of stone, but on human hearts. We are confident of all of this because of the great trust that we have in God through Christ. Now think about that in the context of worship. You know, if you can imagine for a second, many of you I'm sure can, being in a context where you're engaging in worship with people with dementia or a person with dementia. You come into that situation, and so you bring out your piano or your music or whatever it is, and you begin to say some prayers. And suddenly, people who previously have not really engaged with you come into the room in a different way. People experience the world in a different way. What Paul's saying there is that when you see people's bodies begin to move to the rhythm of worship, be that in prayer, be that in sacrament, whatever it is, you're seeing a letter that's been written on their bodies by Jesus. It contains neurology, but it's not defined by neurology. And so each of these movements is a movement of worship. Each of these movements that somebody engages in is a gesture towards God. Now, it may well be that people are no longer able to cognate things in the way that they used to do, or think about it in the way that we used to, and also think about it in the way that very often we assume they should do, but their bodies haven't forgotten. And Paul's pretty clear that the Spirit groans with words that we cannot understand. And the Spirit doesn't abandon your body. If you think about the Genesis account of creation, God creates human beings out of dust and blows God's breath into them, and Adam becomes a living being, held together, held in place only because of the breath of God. So each one of our bodies, in that sense, is held in place and exists only because of the breath of God. Genesis doesn't say that God created a human being and prioritized their brain. He says God created a human being in all of its fullness. The Incarnation tells us exactly the same thing. God cares for human beings in all of their fullness, not just simply your brains, but all of us, each cell of your body. And so what you see there in that context of worship is spirituality worked out in the present, memory worked out in the present. So we're very used to thinking memory is something that happens in the past and we bring it into the present. But actually what you do when you see people is memory working itself out. And so when you begin to shift your focus a little bit in the context of worship, you begin to see different things. Because one of the things that's absolutely necessary to do when you're engaging in worship with people with dementia, and probably we should be doing all the time, is to slow down and take time for those things that the world considers to be trivial. So when you slow down and move into a different mode of time, you begin to see things that you wouldn't see at other points. You know, you've probably had that experience where you're with someone and they suddenly for a moment they're with you in all of the fullness. And it's only for a moment, and then it goes. But if you're moving too quickly, and if you're not looking at that person properly, you miss the beauty of that moment. Now, there's a spiritual tradition within the Christian faith called the Sacrament of the present moment. Now, a sacrament is a visible sign of an invisible grace. And the sacrament of the present moment is when you recognize and stop and take the time to recognize that every breath is given to you by God. That everything that you have, everything that you are, is grace and gift. And when you engage in the sacrament of the present moment, you begin to see things that you would miss otherwise. Because very often people, particularly with advanced dementia, live in that moment. And if you're not in that moment with them, then you'll miss the moment, and they will miss you. So, shifting our understanding of time, finding that sacrament of the present moment, recognizing the significance of people's bodies is a beginning point for faithful worship. So let me give you two examples of things that I think you might find interesting. One of my friends, colleagues, is a chaplain who works alongside people living with advanced dementia. And she told me this story the other day about a woman that she was working with called Beatrice. And so Beatrice was in her 90s, and she had quite significant dementia. And for most of her life, she was kind of disengaged. It's very difficult to get through to her. But my colleague, went and sat beside Beatrice, and they sat down, and she said to Beatrice, Beatrice, I'm going to pray with you. And so Beatrice didn't say anything. And so she sat down and began to say the Lord's Prayer. And she said, Our Father. And as soon as she said, Our Father, Beatrice began to pray. Now, my friend said, I have no idea what it was that she was saying. I couldn't understand a word of it, but I know that it was intentional. She was saying something. And then she went back to that passage from Paul, saying, the Spirit groans with sounds that we cannot understand. And she said, I suddenly realized what that meant as I saw it embodied in Beatrice. And so Beatrice prayed, and she prayed, and she prayed, and eventually my friend had to stop her because she was constantly keeping going. So she said, in the name of the Father, Amen, and Beatrice stopped. And she was gone again, in the sense that she was no longer responsive. But in those few moments, something profound happened. And my friend said to me, the key thing to think about in relation to Beatrice is that Scripture tells us very clearly that when people pray, God listens. When Beatrice prayed, something changed in the world. And I thought it was a really beautiful illustration. When Beatrice prays, something changes in the world. A world that will write off people like Beatrice, and sometimes religions that write off people like Beatrice. Perhaps she is a prayer warrior in a different way, in a more gentle way. So keep that in mind, that sometimes we forget that because you have some degree of brain damage doesn't mean you're not a disciple, and doesn't mean you don't have a vocation. So music and memory is another thing that we need to think about as I'm coming towards the end of what I want to say to you. In the midst of that service that I want you to imagine if you're playing the music and suddenly people begin to respond. I want you to think about why that is and how we might think about that. So going back to Oliver Sacks, in another book that he wrote called Musicophilia, within which he has really a series of really interesting essays on different neurological conditions that affect your musical ability. For example, savants that can suddenly play the piano, and people who either lose or gain tremendous musical skills because they have a certain amount of brain damage. It's very, very interesting. But the last chapter of that book is titled Alzheimer's. And in it he reflects on the significance of music for people living with dementia. And it's interesting because he points out that very often with dementia, it's not so much that you have forgotten things in the sense that these memories disappear. It's your inability to access them. So the neurons and the synapses that enable you to get to the memory are broken, so therefore you can't get to that memory. And so you've got a memory there, and all of us have this. Most of our memories are still in our head somewhere, but you just can't quite get to them. But he points out, in the way that we've been talking about, that the brain is plastic, so it's constantly on the move, constantly connecting and reconnecting. And the part of the brain that's responsible for processing memory, now memory is processed all over the place, but there's parts of it are more focused, is very close to the part of the brain that relates to music. And so what the brain can do is it can reconfigure the impulses around the damage using the neural pathways of music in order that a person can access their memories. And so as long as the music's playing, people will access this memory. And of course, if you think about what a memory is, to experience a memory, it's not just like you hum along to music. It takes you to a place, it takes you to a time, it takes you to a set of relationships in the community, it takes you to an identity within yourself that you may have forgotten or may be in the past. So as long as that music plays, people can access these memories, and people can find great joy and great comfort in these memories. But only as long as the music plays. So as soon as the music stops, and so the access to that memory also stops. So people will have a little bit of residual happiness, but they won't, gradually over time, they won't be able to identify what that means. So the key thing for us in terms of dementia care, and dementia care in the context of worship, is to be able to prize that moment. To be able to recognize that it's much more than simply people singing and being happy, nice as that may be. That actually something profoundly important is going on during that time space. And the only way that we can recognize is that by engaging in the sacrament of the present moment and realizing that. And also recognizing that when that moment has gone, we need to move on. So it's a little bit like Peter when he's on top of the mountain. He wants to stay in the mountain in transcendence forever and ever. And Jesus says, you've got to come down the mountain. It's disappointing. But if we can be in that moment, then wonderful things, in principle, can happen for us. So, one more thing to tell you. And this is a theological point. This is something that I think the Christian tradition brings to the table in a way that nobody else can do. Whereas we tend to think that our memory is trapped within our heads and trapped within our neurology, as we've seen, actually that's not true. It's within our bodies. Very often it's within our communities. But ultimately, our memories sit with God. And I'll give you a story as I close that can illustrate that. So, one of my colleagues, Margaret Hutchison, who is a nurse that lives in Adelaide, she gave me this story many, many years ago, but it will make the point I want to make. And she talks about this woman who was in what was then called a dementia ward. Thankfully, people don't name things that way nowadays. But this woman was going through kind of the mid-stages of her dementia journey, and she was normally a very placid, very peaceful person who just enjoyed life. But for no obvious reason, she suddenly became deeply disturbed. And so she started to walk up and down the ward, repeating the same word over and over and over and over again. And she was clearly anxious, clearly distressed. So the ward team got together and they decided, what can we do with this person? Should we put her to a locked ward? Should we medicate her? Should we restrain her? All the standard ways in which a medical context, the options you might have for dealing with a situation like that. But eventually one nurse got alongside her, and this nurse was a Christian, and she started to walk with her. And so she walked up and down the ward, and she began to listen to this woman. And she worked it out. The woman was saying the same word over and over again, and that word was God. So she's saying, God, 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 God. And the nurse almost immediately worked out what was going on. And she said to the woman, "Are you afraid that you're going to forget God?" And the woman stopped immediately and looked her in the eyes, and she said, "Yes." So all of her life, she had been a Christian. Her whole identity, her whole way of being in the world was shaped and formed by her perspective on God and herself as a disciple. And she was terrified that if she lost her memory, then she would lose God. And so the nurse said to her, "Well, you may well lose your memory of God, but God will never forget you." And immediately she found peace, because she recognized that, well, maybe I'll be a time when I can't do the things that I used to be able to do, but God can always do the things that He's able to do. And I think it comes to the context of worship and dementia. That story takes us right into the zone. It's never about what we can remember. Faith is never about what we can remember. It's always about how God remembers us. Because we live in fragile, broken bodies that fall apart over time, but God remains steadfast. So our task as people who are interested in dementia and interested in helping people to worship well is to help them to remember through your actions, through the communities you create, through the atmosphere, that they are loved and that God continues to love them, even though they may struggle with some things that were so difficult, so easy earlier on, but are so difficult now. So there's one thing I want you to do before we go. Love sits at the heart of the gospel. It's all about love. God is love. We are beings who are loved. So I need you to help me to create a community. So if we think about love in this way, love is God saying to us, "It's good that you are here. I'm glad that you exist." And that's saying to one another, "It's good that you're here. I'm glad that you exist." I'd like you to say that to the person beside you, even if you don't like them. We did one of these seminars was it Turramurra, I think it was. And like everybody was having a great time loving one another, and I was standing up here on my own, nobody loved me at all. So and you guys did the same thing. You created me as a marginalised group. It's outrageous. But the simplicity of that is what I want you to think about. Like, people with dementia are people who need to be loved, like all of us. So thank you for listening.
Well, thank you, John. Now we're going to have questions. So I've got some helpers who are going to help me distribute microphones. One's Nina. I think the other one's Rhiannon. So if you'd like to ask John a question, please let's make the most of having him all the way down under. So just grab the attention of these guys, and we'll be able to hear your question on the microphone. Thank you so much.
Hi, John. I'm a chaplain in aged care.
Hi.
And what I've discovered just really recently is some of the group worship things that I've been able to do with the residents are no longer working. With some other research with other people who are more skilled in dementia than I am, they have said that there's no group work actually working very well in that area at the moment. Would you think that worship is better off one-on-one with dementia as opposed to groups?
Worship is always a communal activity in the sense that it's something that we do together. Right? But sometimes the type of community that we find ourselves in makes it very difficult for us to worship. So it may be that somebody has particular concerns or particular neurological damage. It makes it difficult for them, for example, just to be in a crowd of people. Right? Or even if you've got really bad hearing and your hearing aid, it's difficult to be a lot of people. So for some people, one-to-one worship is definitely a good way to do it. Like. For others, it would depend on the context within which you're doing it. So I think one-to-one worship is definitely authentic, but also having somebody who feels that they're participating in something beyond themselves is also important. Yeah.
We're just a group of people from a church that visit a nursing home. There's a lot of people with dementia there, and I know you've talked a lot about memory. What if people don't have any memory of Jesus or church or anything like that, having been in their lives? Even from long ago, how do you connect with those people about Jesus? What does the research say How do you reach their heart when they don't have any of those long-reaching memories that you can try and draw on, or music that you can use to bring them into that conversation?
Well, I mean, you've put your finger on a really important point, because if I can give you an illustration, like the church I go to back home is a Presbyterian church that thinks it's a Pentecostal church. So it kind of does a bit of both. That's why you like it, John. That's why I like it. It's exactly why I like it. I'm having a difficulty to keep my hands down. However, we never do the same things twice, right? So every week is different. Every week has different songs, different prayers, different. The basic shape and structure is the same, but it's different. So, and that's the same for a lot of churches, that people don't really get the opportunity to build up the neurological thickness that's necessary, that when it comes to the time of dementia, that you're able to be contacted by in these different ways. I mean, so good dementia-friendly worship is repetitive and boring over time, because that's the way that you learn things. And so I don't have an answer for your question. If your question is how do you reach people who have had no connection with the church whatsoever, how can you reach them with your worship and music later in their lives? I don't know what the answer to that is. I would have done 10 years ago, because most people would come through Sunday school and most people would have these formative years where they can build that up. Now it's a very difficult thing. I don't think to my knowledge, I don't think anybody's really looking at that, but I think we do have to look at that.
Hi, John. I'm in aged care too, working in facility, and we do run church services and have volunteers running them in the dementia-specific unit. Is there anything you would say it's a very challenging space, and it all depends, it changes all the time with the mix of people in there.
Yeah.
So it's always challenging. Is there anything you would say in order to set up that space that you can put into that space that might help with memory and to help then to officiate over a service of sorts?
You mean in terms of resources?
Or just, setting up a cross, a candle, different things like that. Obviously, you're catering to people from different denominations and, running something very simple. I think some of those things help prompt memory, but they're going to be quite different and diverse.
They are. That's absolutely right. I don't want to avoid the question, because I think the question is absolutely right. But the Faith for Life materials that are going to be talked about later on are kind of designed to help you to fill that space with content in a sense. But there's certain forms of music and certain icons, the cross, for example, that are across denominations. So the key thing would be to find the most powerful cross-denominational images to use, both in terms of music and in terms of the physical things that you grasp on. But I think that you might find some help in what the other folks in this seminar have to say.
Well, thanks. I'm involved as a music volunteer in dementia care, and I'm interested in the question of how music actually helps memory. Does it have to be a piece of music that's very specific as being special to that person, or do other kinds of music work and somehow open up those pathways to memory? Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah. Well, Joanna will speak about that a little bit later on that very point. So I don't want to encroach on what she's got to say. But I would say that the forms of music that are most effective in that sense, if that's the right word, are things that people are close to, things that people have clearly been part of their history and has been significant to them over time. So I'll give you an example. I have a colleague, and that's a friend actually, who's creating a memory box just now. And in it she's putting all the music she has that she wants to be played to her if she ever has dementia. And so in that box she's putting in Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple, the Eagles. It's great. And her one fear is that people will play Scottish country dance music to her when she gets into So she's preparing the way.
Mine's more of a comment. I work in aged care and have been doing dementia services for many years. And just in the setup, I have found it very helpful to have the hymns playing beforehand as people come in to the space. And we are fortunate where I work to have a dedicated chapel that's got some pseudo stained glass windows at the back. And so that, I think, can help, because sometimes people can be quite agitated and, different behaviors, but that helps to settle. Now, I have noticed people coming to the services who are supposedly totally unchurched, but I have observed that when they're in the presence of God, it's spirit to spirit. Yeah. I don't know what God's doing, but I can feel teary right now thinking about some of the things that I have observed. So we don't know what goes on. Yeah. We're just there to create the atmosphere, the presence of God. Yeah. I've played music that they may not know. I go to a Pentecostal church to some of our more gentle worship songs at the end of the service. And I have seen people sit for half an hour, 45 minutes after the service. Nobody's doing anything. They're free to get up and go, and they just sit with different music playing.
That's great. That's a great comment. And I think one of the things that being around people with dementia helps us to remember is the power of the Spirit. Because very often we talk about the power of the Spirit, but then we kind of make it into an intellectual thing. Whereas I think you're saying quite rightly that there's a mystery and there's an openness that the Spirit can provide for us in ways that we overlook sometimes. Exactly. Well, thank you.
I've got a question about the sacrament of present that I really love. I'm not a researcher in dementia, but I was just listening to it reminded me of a piece of research done by one of my friends who's a youth researcher about presentism in youth culture, where millennials today live in the now. What's the difference between what we see as harmful in youth culture living in the now and I guess the redemption of living in the now that you're speaking of, and how can those things dialogue with each other?
Well, I think that's a very good question. And I think it's fair to say that presence and lack of presence is one of the most significant cultural issues that we face at this moment in time. If you look at the way that people use their phones, if you look at the way in which people engage, if you're in a restaurant, you're sitting in a restaurant, and you look across at the table, there'll be 4 people all on their phones doing different things. So they'll be present within that room and that table, but not present beyond that. Right? And so there's a cultural problem with presence, I think, which is manifested quite sharply in the context of dementia, because if you're not present with a person with dementia, then you may as well not be there at all. So there's a kind of tension between a culture that says absence is the best way for you to be, and a human experience that says, actually, we need to completely rethink our understanding of presence. And so the idea of the sacrament of the present moment is countercultural. It calls us back to the significance of being present, not just with people with dementia, but actually with all of us.
Thanks, John. 2 more questions. I think there's one up here.
Hi, John.
Terrific.
Yeah.
Hello.
Mine is just a comment. I was thinking we always think about residential care. We don't think about community. And we have many people who are very early with dementia. So maybe the need for us in the community as well to look at people who are early and their lives with Jesus and how we take that forward.
Yeah. Thank you for that.
I think there's one up there, and I think there's one more question down here as well. They might be our last 2. If you can just run the microphone around here, Rhiannon, the back and then front. Thanks.
Do you have anything to share with us about ministry to staff who are working with people with dementia?
Yes. That's right. What I would say is that in order to, looking after somebody with dementia, it can be very, very hard work. Whether you're at home or whether you're in a professional context, it's draining, it's taxing, it's exhausting. And people need to have context, need to be very clear that self-care is extremely important. So the way I would look at it from a Christian point of view would be Jesus, when he's talking about the sum of the law and the prophets, says to love God, love your neighbour, and love yourself. And so loving yourself is a fundamentally important aspect of loving God. And I don't mean being narcissistic, but looking after yourself in that sense is something that Jesus clearly wants us to do. The problem for people very often, particularly people in a home context, but also for people in a professional context where they have limited time and high-pressure jobs, is that there's no respite. And so one of the gifts that I think that the church can offer to families in particular, but maybe professionals as well, is the gift of respite. To be a place where there are people who are there to offer friendship and respite on a short or a long-term basis is actually something that's fundamental, I think, to the idea of the body of Christ. So I think that carers need to look after themselves, but they also need a supportive community that understands what they're going through and has the resources to enable them to find respite in that godly way.
One last question here at the front. There, thank you.
Hi, John.
Hiya.
I have a comment to make. The first one is, it's good you are here, and we are very glad you exist.
Thank you very much. I feel loved.
The second comment is, I work in aged care too as a therapist, and I do pain management, and I found that your words today were just an encouragement, but also a conviction, I suppose, that sometimes when I'm sitting and doing my treatment, I think, what am I doing? Is it really making a difference? But I found that with some of the people, particularly those that are Christians, if I started to sing a very basic Christian song while I was doing treatment, they even responded to the physical treatment much better. So I don't know if you've come across any comments like that before.
Well, I have come across that. I mean, I think that there is some interesting work done in music and pain. But there's something else. So pain management is central to your job. So I've been thinking about pain recently. No offence, my wife's here. It wasn't in the context of my marriage. But yeah, so this is how I've been thinking about it, because we talk a lot about spirituality and spiritual care, particularly within a professional context, but I'm never quite sure what that means. I oftentimes think spiritual care is just doing what you do anyway, but looking at it slightly differently. But when it comes to pain management, it's interesting to ask the question, what does pain do? So pain alienates yourself, from your community, and from God. So pain is the enemy of community. So by giving good pain management, you actually reconnect the person with themselves, with their community, and with God. So giving good pain management and administering effective pain medication is actually a spiritual practice. Something that's deeply spiritual in its consequences, and for Christians should be deeply spiritual in the way that we adhere it. And I think if you take that kind of way of thinking and apply that to a lot of the tasks that we do, you can see that actually spiritual care is much richer and much thicker, if you like, than sometimes we give it credit for.
Thank you.